Hello and welcome on the Barricades. This is the second segment of our conversation with Pat Byrne on the current situation in Ukraine. We're discussing the war, which is at the moment the most important event in global politics. Pat, I would like to ask you to please, uh, give us your take about the kind of the history behind that war that started a little less than a week ago.
Well, obviously, you could go back in history to, the after the First World War and so on. But I think that it's better that we perhaps restrict this to what's happened since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991.
Or maybe at the break
Uh,
of the breakup of the Soviet Union, when this meeting in Reykjavik,
yeah,
and
exactly.
the
Yeah,
promises that were made to Gorbachev.
on the 6th of, when they had that meeting over the 6th, that weekend, the 6th to the 8th of December. Yeah, exactly. When in fact the actual the Soviet Union was broken up illegally. That's the first
That's
thing we
true.
should say about that. And what happened was that the earlier in the year there had been a referendum where 75% of the Soviet Union had voted to keep the Soviet Union, quite specifically in a referendum. And yet the leaders of the three main republics in the Soviet Union, Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, got together and basically cobbled up a decision to basically end the Soviet Union, break it up. And unfortunately, Gorbachev, who I have to say was, made so many mistakes in his, he did some good things
Yeah, but mostly mistakes.
in
Let's be honest.
well, no. Some of the things he did were good, but his intentions were good. But he made so many mistakes, which we don't have time to go into
Mm,
here now. But
mm,
one of them was that he was the president. He was the president of the Soviet Union, and his job. I mean, if there's nothing else you do as a president, is defend your constitution. So when these three leaders did what they did, and they try to take advantage of all the confusion that had been caused by that stupid coup in August 91. Then he didn't do anything about it. He just accepted that these three
yeah.
leaders, against all the rest of the Soviet Union, that they could decide to
Yeah,
break it up like that.
yeah. I just want to add here that he could have at least reacted against Yeltsin, because it was Yeltsin who pulled the carpet from beneath his feet,
Exactly.
so to say.
Yeah.
Right? Like, this
Exactly.
is how it all
Yeah.
started. Well, as you said, we don't have time to actually dive
No.
into it right now,
Sure.
but we're gonna do that. We're gonna save that for
All
another
right.
program. That's
Of
definitely
course.
something that deserves a revisit.
So the Soviet Union broke up in very strange circumstances without the support of the people, and that's an important thing to say. And that has left over in a lot of people's minds, especially in Russia. Um, they don't. Many people don't really accept that happened. I'm not even talking about the communists versus the left and right issues here, but just
Mhm.
the actual national country link-up federation set up. So I mean, so that's a huge problem that's hanging over and underlies some of the aspects of these things. But since then, what what was very strange was that the America helped behind the scenes. America was working very closely with Yeltsin, and no doubt we're advising him and helping him with this breakup and the transition that followed it. And despite the fact that Yeltsin did everything the Americans wanted, um, and to the point where he privatized the economy with the shock doctrine and all the rest of it, just drastically impoverished the population. The same process happened, of course, in Ukraine. The fact that Yeltsin did these things, behaved like a puppet of the Americans, wasn't good enough for the Americans. First of all, despite the fact it wasn't America that broke up, there's this myth that America broke up the Soviet Union. It wasn't. It internally imploded. It wasn't the Americans who decided this, but they treated Russia like a defeated enemy.
Mm.
This is contrary. It's funny. I watched this an interview recently with James Matlock, who was the ambassador in the Soviet Union through most of Gorbachev's term. And he was explaining how, because he doesn't agree at all with this strategy that America's been following and NATO and so on, expanding eastwards. And he said that actually what all their thinking was that that the following the breakup of the Soviet Union, this was a golden opportunity for Europe to come together and to have a common security organization. And whether that was in the form of NATO, or whether it was in the form of an increased powers for the OSCE, or whatever, that was what even the diplomats on the American side were expecting to happen, so that everybody would be in NATO or would be in some other
Let me just
security
interject here
organization.
that there was an attempt to do that. There was this attempt to create so-called hexagonale, which then the Germans basically split up right after the reunification, which was like Italy, Yugoslavia, Poland, and I don't remember all the countries. I think Austria was there, but anyway, this was in Czechoslovakia also before the split. So there was a kind of attempt to do that, but it was immediately shattered by Germany after the reunification. And afterwards, they of course went ahead to actually split up Yugoslavia, which also ended up in a violent, violent war.
So and Russia wanted to join NATO. They actually,
Russia, people don't remember that. Yeah.
That was the second application to join NATO. Yeah. Russia applied to join NATO in 1954. So anyway, so they wanted to join NATO, and Russia couldn't understand. Yeltsin couldn't understand why America was treating Russia with such contempt and in such a hostile way. Now, in a way, it was almost like they were kicking the dog while it was down. That kind of attitude. It was kind of arrogance of Russia. America had this arrogance that we're now the only superpower. It's going to be the American century.
American exceptionalism, isn't it?
This was going to be the American. This is going to be the Pax Americana, they called them, things like that. Now, this naturally caused a lot of growing resentment in Russia, and the population were in such poverty because of these neoliberal doctrines imposed, and privatization and all the rip-off of the state assets into hands of a few gangsters and oligarchs. So Yeltsin increasingly lost popularity in the country. Even he began to complain towards the end of his period of office, at the end of the 90s. He began to complain about the way he was being treated. So when Putin took over from Yeltsin, he had some illusions. He still hoped that he'd have a better relationship with the US, but it just continued. And then, what happened with him was Putin came under tremendous public pressure from the public in Russia. They were, and as I said, the people were very discontented with the oligarchs, with the political and military weakness of the Russian Federation, and so on. So he began to reassert Russian state control. First of all, by bringing the oligarchs under control. For example, he sent agents around to different Western nations and threatened oligarchs that they could keep their ill-gotten gains, because these oligarchs.
Some of it, like just for cigarettes and soda, that's enough. A couple of millions, right? The yachts or whatever. But otherwise, everything had to go back under the form of direct foreign investment. Right?
They could keep them, but as long as they repatriated the money. Now these oligarchs had not only stolen billions, but they deliberately took them out of the country to make sure that nobody could get it back. But they didn't count on the fact that Putin was willing to use his favorite methods, no doubt, from his years in the KGB. So as a result, the ones who refused to do that, some of them were eliminated, some of them were imprisoned, as an example to the others. So, of course, in this way, Putin brought the oligarchs under his control effectively. And because of that, he also reasserted Russian, sovereignty, and try to deal with some of these, struggles that were happening in Chechnya and so on. And as a result, he became very popular among Russian people. But on the other side, he became an enemy to the Americans, because they saw, and this is a lot of people wonder why the Americans are having this war with Russia. Why this constant conflict with Russia, particularly as China is now becoming an increasing threat to American control and American heavy. And they wonder, why is it they're doing this with Russia? Why they're not making an alliance with Russia? The first alliance that Nixon in the early 1970s. And the reason is because America basically decides on who it supports and who it opposes based on whether it can control them or not. And do you remember me and you had a discussion a couple of months ago about the Summit for Democracy?
Yeah.
In that
That's
was the
actually
Americans
last
organized.
month.
It seems a long time ago, doesn't it? Right?
Yeah, I know.
Um, and we both analysed. We were looking at who was invited to that summit, and we both noted that, and we were thinking about why was it that Poland was invited but Hungary was not, despite the fact
Exactly.
that
That's
on
a
most
control
metrics,
factor.
on most metrics, Poland's pretty well similar to Hungary, and the Polish regime admires a lot of what Hungary does, and probably would wish to emulate it. But as you said, it was the control factor that Poland's willing to do whatever America tells it to do, whereas Hungary's not. So it's not about human rights, democracy, or anything else. It's all about do these countries bow the knee to America or not? And
Yeah.
obviously, quite clearly, Russia was not doing that under Putin, and that's the basis for why they demonize him and
Yeah,
try
but,
to
I
describe
want
him
to
as
I want to
Hitler.
ask you
And
here. Do you think that there's also an element, because obviously that in terms of clear geopolitical, this word became very fashionable, by the way, and many people use it without really knowing what it means. But anyway, in clear geopolitical struggle, okay, that's obviously the case, that there's the empire, and the empire has to control, divide, and rule, and all the rest of it. That's true. But do you think that there's also an element of some kind of ideological, how to say this, like that they are kind of getting carried away by their own propaganda, by their own ideology? We just mentioned a couple of minutes ago this American, or in the previous segment really, the American exceptionalism, the American, Pax Americana, the Washington consensus, and the idea that now there's the West, or as the Russians like to refer to it, the collective West, with its one centralized, in terms of foreign policy, decision making center, which is Washington. And this is, as Fukuyama put it in his terrible book, which aged really badly, The End of History. Right, and that's going to be just liberal democracies all over the world, and that they are just, many of those people could just, perhaps, I don't know, I'm asking, what's your take? Could be ideologues, that
well,
they are just Western chauvinist, kind of, supremacists, that treat people in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe, in Russia, like other, they refer to them as like some sort of Untermenschen, like not, or not
there's no
publicly,
doubt.
but that's what they
Yeah,
think about it.
there's no doubt that racist attitudes among the right who control American politics, that these racist that there's that racist attitudes do exist, and come out at certain points. But I don't know if this explains this current conflict. After all, look at the Japanese. The Japanese were regarded by the Westerners, until they became modern and rich, they were regarded as uh, even worse than the Chinese in some ways, particularly
Mhm.
since the Second World War and all the brutality that they inflicted on Western troops and so on. So, there was a great hatred for Japanese people in layers of society in the West. So, but look at how they treat them now and how they view them now. So I think it's not. I think it's more an economic and political thing, but obviously
No,
racism is
more
always there.
absolutely, but
Yeah,
there is an element of that. Do you agree with me?
of
I mean,
course.
it's just my
Well, I
speculation
don't
here. I
know.
obviously,
I don't know. I mean, there's also the stupid hangover that I noticed in some of these banners on these demonstrations this last weekend, um, that people had put Putin, and then they put a hammer and sickle, and a red hammer and
yeah,
sickle
yeah,
on Putin's face,
like
which is
crazy,
ridiculous. So
crazy. Yeah,
yeah, but so it shows you that there's a hangover of anti Russian feeling from the Cold War. So there's all these. But I mean, one factor that I think is true, what you're saying there, is this question of democracy, but the capitalist form of democracy, because Putin, there's no question that Putin basically moved away from the standard form of capitalist democracy pretty quickly, towards a system of manipulated control, where basically he took over the media. Which, if you don't, if you've got a government controlled media, you can't really operate a capitalist democracy, and it basically he came to dominate the society and the administration, and he's been in power ever since. So of course, he's been in power since he came to power. He never, never lost it. So I think that is a factor in this. of course, we're about to see that come in America, aren't we? So it's not going to be very long that they're going to be able to. So they are imitating. They're moving that direction as well. I
Yeah, by
mean,
the way, I just
Erdogan,
want to
for example.
interject here. Maria
Yeah.
Chernat, my colleague that is unfortunately was not available this
Uh-huh.
evening for this recording, she made that point in one of our programs that we recorded at the beginning, during last weekend, that, if you want to confront Putin and you want to be like, more democratic, then don't be him, don't mimic him, but like be more democratic and lead by example,
Sure.
those people that you want to sort of mobilize in favor of democracy and so on. But that's not really happening. What we see is growing authoritarianism in the West. I mean,
Sure.
there's no, no
Exactly.
no
That's
time for us
exactly.
to dive into that.
Yeah.
But there's so much authoritarianism now, and
Sure.
on top of everything, I'm afraid, and I can already see elements of that playing out. It's the war is only going to strengthen that.
It
And
is.
of
Yeah,
course,
that's true.
we, like the independent journalists, are going to be the first victims of that, by the way. But that's, I
Yeah,
don't
of
want to
course.
complain
Yeah.
here. That's another story.
But I mean, there is the democracy that the West. This is one of the things that a lot of people don't understand, is that the reason why America would like Putin to adopt a more democratic system like they have in some other countries in the West and so on is not because they want a government that actually rules on behalf of the people and does things in the interest of people. Because as we're seeing in most of the democratic countries, they're not doing that.
Hmm.
They're actually, the people are very discontented with the governments, whoever they elect into power. But the reason why the West wants this kind of government is because they can influence it better. So
Yeah.
once you open up your electoral system, then the money, the people with the money from abroad can then buy TV stations to influence opinion. They can buy politicians. They can buy political parties, etc.,
And the show
etc.
can
So
go on, right? Like,
yeah,
no
so then
problem. Whatever, whoever wins
yeah.
the elections are always won. That's the.
Yeah, they can then have much greater influence over these countries. So that's what the real reason why they. I know that sounds very cynical, but that's actually the truth. That's why
Yeah,
they want
yeah,
these
yeah.
democratic systems in Russia and elsewhere. So so that's where we are in terms of the background of how America's treated Russia generally, and then we come on to the question of NATO.
Hmm.
Now, I don't want to repeat because I think this point has been made so many times by on other channels. But I think most of us are all aware about the promises that were made to the Soviet
Not
Union.
1 inch. Not one
Yeah,
inch.
yeah,
That was
they
the
would,
phrase.
they would, yeah. I think that was James Baker promised they wouldn't
Exactly.
move 1 inch NATO 1 inch eastwards, right? Um, and but also it's interesting that if you look at, and again the comparison's been made with Cuba in 1962, isn't it? That
Yeah.
when Russia installed um, soldiers and nuclear weapons on Cuba's soil, um, uh, didn't matter about the United Nations. It never came
Hmm.
into it really. They debated it in the United Nations, but the charter was never even mentioned. That
Hmm.
America was willing to have a military, was willing to have a nuclear war over that question. So, and now they're talking about going right up to
Yeah,
the
but
border with
if I may
Soviet
here,
Union.
let's just
Yeah.
clarify this because this comparison is, of course, I think to an extent accurate. Some call it, Cuban missile crisis in reverse. Some point out that it's not exactly in reverse because there were military installations in Turkey first involved. I mean, Western military installations in Turkey were going to be there, and then Khrushchev was
Yeah.
had this idea that he later realized to install the missiles, in Cuba. And then what
Hmm.
happened, and here is the part that makes sense to sort of, this is the part of the comparison that really makes sense, because what happened then is that Kennedy said, Mr. Khrushchev, take those rockets or those missiles out of Cuba, or if you don't, we're going to take them out. And this is precisely what happened in November and December last year, when Mr. Putin was trying to say to all, to all other misters, like, Biden, Schultz's, Macron's, and so, like, take this thing, out of my doorstep, because if it continues, I'm going to react. I'm going to take it down myself. And they all thought that it's just a bluff, no, like, he's not going to do that. He's too weak. And like,
Mhm.
I don't know what their thoughts were. This is just my speculation, right? But they never thought that someone would dare militarily intervene against, Western policies, even if they were threatening directly. And I think we can agree on this, regardless of what we think about Putin and his views and the regime there and so on and so
Mhm.
forth. This was Ukraine in the form and shape that was programmed to be after the 2014 coup, was and remains to be a direct threat to the national security, okay, of the capitalist Russia as it is today.
Well, they have. You mentioned the 2014 coup. A lot of people are not aware that before the coup, um, Ukraine was actually neutral,
Yeah.
and it had it in its constitution that it couldn't join NATO. And this had
Hmm.
been the agreement between Russia and America and the other relevant states and Ukraine in the years following the breakup of the Soviet Union. So, and then of course one of the main purposes of the coup, which most people are not following that closely, was to change the constitution of Ukraine so that it could allow it to join NATO. And of course, now people say, well, uh, that it's no chance of joining NATO, is there, because of all these problems in Ukraine? But what they don't realize was that that wasn't in the plans of the Americans. Was that Ukraine would join NATO, but then all their plans were upset by the fact that Putin took over the Crimea and also helped the breakaway republic. So as a result, um, you then had territorial disputes ongoing in Ukraine. So therefore, under the rules of NATO, they couldn't join
Oh
because
yeah, but
you have to
I've
be.
no doubt that they would actually go ahead and actually break their own provisions. I mean, they've done
Oh,
that
that's
in the past.
that's a
Yeah.
that in fact, if you listen carefully to some of the statements and so on, that it seemed that they were moving in that direction, that they'd make an exception or something. And on top of that, they were actually making, Ukraine was becoming a de facto um, NATO state. Because they were involving all their military in these common exercises. They were importing all these trainers. They were bringing all these weapons. So it was virtually becoming a NATO state more and more. So that's why Putin became particularly angry about this, and he saw this thing developing. So but anyway, I think that we can see all these examples. Now, another question, of course, about NATO is there's been an argument that NATO is a defensive military alliance. But I think we've seen from the evidence of the last period that what these wars in Yugoslavia, in Libya, in
Exactly.
Afghanistan, they've even got ongoing African missions and so on. How are they defensive? I mean, they're not even. These are, apart from Yugoslavia, they're not even wars in Europe. It's supposed to be a European, North American treaty organization.
Mhm.
What the heck? Why are they going around the world
Exactly. And
acting like a world
NATO
policeman?
NA stands for North Atlantic. As far as I'm concerned, Russia is not on the North Atlantic, or Ukraine, for
I
that
know
matter.
exactly. So anyway, um, we go. Yeah. So I think, I mean, there's a lot being said about NATO. Perhaps we should move on to what's been happening in Ukraine itself.
Exactly. But
Um,
before we go there, I just want
sorry.
to close this segment. But I also want to add one more thing here. It's important to say that this status, this neutral status, or perhaps a status of a certain balance, was important not only in this international dimension, but also in the internal dimension, because people are not aware of that. Mm, Ukraine. I mean, people in Eastern Europe are aware of that. Most of those who actually follow what's happening on the public arena, but or are familiar with the history of their own region. But in the West, people don't know that Ukraine was not, and has never been since its inception in 1991, a stable, coherent, country like we know from other parts of Europe. Ukraine has always been a very divided country between its west and its
Sure.
east, between the people in the west, between the people in the west. And we're talking about, even the very identification of the citizens of Ukraine, many of them, identifying exactly as this ethno-national kind of, like using this ethno-national categories, okay, to define themselves, like in the west in particular. But then there are those, identifying themselves as Ukrainians but really Russian leaning, Russian identifying Ukrainians. I mean, many call them,
Hmm.
in Ukraine particularly today, Russians, and they've done a very bad job actually trying to come into any kind of agreement after 2014, because they were denouncing them all the time as Russian, agents of influence or agents of Kremlin and stuff like that. And
Hmm.
then
Hmm.
eventually it turned into this bloody conflict that was that has been going on for 8 years. But what I want to say is that, the president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, who was overthrown, okay, in 2014, he has been deemed by Western media, corporate media, as pro-Russian, and that's why he had to be ousted by, the democracy-wanting, demanding Ukrainian
Hmm.
nation. And democracy always comes with the West, so the demonstrations and the Ukrainian nation was like sort of trying to attach Ukraine to the West, which is democracy and so on and so on. So this is not true. First of all, I want to say that Viktor Yanukovych was not pro-Russian. He was just a person who understood that, the balance must be maintained at all costs, because otherwise disaster will unfold. And everyone knew that in the Ukrainian political class. And I want to say here, to the credit of Russia, by the way, and to the credit of Yanukovych, that when this European Union deal was floated, then Russia didn't say no, despite the fact that it was obviously, over the top, okay, for them, and I think even for the balance that I mentioned, that was important for the Ukrainian stability. But okay, they said, fine, you want to go for this European Union membership? All right, but we have to do it together, because there are so many elements that connect the Ukrainian economy, and they were in place already then. There were so many elements, connecting the Ukrainian and the Russian economy, like, for
Sure.
example, the question of the customs and so on and so forth. So we have to do it together. And also the reason why Yanukovych and a large portion of the Ukrainian ruling class was prepared to actually do that is because of the dire economic situation that the country was in. Of course, it was much better than it is now, but still it was very dire, and they were hoping that they're going to get some money, okay. And the
Hmm.
problems occurred the moment the first draft of the deal was put on Yanukovych's desk, and he started going through it, and it was like, fine, fine, values, democracy, human rights, all the rest of it. Yeah, where's the money? Where's the
Hmm.
money? That was, the question that popped up. And then the European Commission, I can't remember, unfortunately, who uttered that phrase. I can't remember whom exactly, but someone from the European Commission, I don't know whether it was Juncker or some other bureaucrat, they said, no, no, it's not about money. It's about
So
a civilizational choice
choice, yeah,
that Ukraine
civilizational
must
choice.
make. And
Hmm.
no one in Ukraine was prepared to make that civilizational choice, whatever it's supposed to mean. And this is, when things started to get tough, this is when they figured out that they actually have to go for the hardline scenario, and they organized this coup. But anyway, you're right. Let's close down this segment. I want to thank you, Pat, for all the comments. I want to
No
thank our
problem.
viewers and listeners for being with us. And I want to invite you, of course, to see the first part of our conversation and the next part of our conversation. We're going to be back shortly. And meanwhile, please don't forget to go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/the barricade, where, to the extent that you feel you can afford, you can support Eastern European independent journalism. Thank you.